So throughout my life, I've always been somewhat interested in personal development or self-development and that personal growth. I always feel like you can always try and aim to be the best possible person you can be. But it was only until about my early 20s that I actually really started to focus on that. And I actually hired a couple of life coaches slash mentors. And one of the things I always noticed that they'd always talk about is becoming present. And you need to remain present or be in your present state at all times. And the term itself sounded great, but I didn't really know what it meant. On the surface level, it sounds pretty good, but it's kind of a bit wishy-washy. It's like one of those terms, like be true to yourself. What does that actually mean? Like, it sounds cool, but does it actually help you? And so the last 6 months or so, I've actually really started to dive quite deep into the whole being present, because you start to see it crop up more and more now, and it's actually becoming quite mainstream. You actually start to see a lot of yoga teachers and meditation experts talk about being present a lot. So I decided to dive in a bit deeper and just kind of have a bit more of an understanding and show you guys some of my thoughts. So if you do any kind of Googling about the term being present, it won't take long for you to see the name Eckhart Tolle. He's actually a very, very popular spiritual teacher. He's quite infamous in the whole spirituality world, and he actually wrote a really interesting book called The Power of Now, which is a bestseller on Amazon. And I actually did a bit of reading for this, and it's actually quite interesting, some of his thoughts. So what does actually becoming present mean to someone? How can it help you? Well, Eckhart Tolle basically goes into explain in his book that essentially a lot of pain and a lot of suffering is almost self-created within our mind, and that we spend a lot of time focusing and paying attention to all the suffering that has gone on either in the past or worrying about things that are happening in the future. Yet those two aspects of our life we cannot control, because the past has happened and obviously the future is yet to happen, and we can't predict the future. So it's this notion of the fact that we're battling back and forth with some two things that we cannot control, yet the one thing that we can control is the present, and how we are basically ignoring that. And ultimately, that if we were to become present and not worry about things that we cannot control, it will ultimately lead us to a happier life. He goes on to state that pain is nothing more than an inner resistance to external factors. And you experience this pain when you're unsatisfied with how things are. However, you're not powerful enough to change that. So ultimately, that turns itself into a negative feeling. And because we only live in the present, we have no means of changing this, so this will be an endless cycle of negative emotions. Now, I think this is actually a really interesting point. I've definitely been guilty of being definitely an overthinker, and I definitely think there has been times where I've kind of sacrificed my own happiness at that current moment, worrying about the future. So for example, when I was younger and for example, I worked in a job that I hated, I'd have that Sunday night feeling. Or I remember being in school and especially having that feeling of like Sunday night and like dreading Monday. And again, it's this, I was sacrificing that present moment of Sunday night of my free time, worrying about the future. And it's funny, when I was reading this book, I kept thinking back to previous things that had happened in my life. I guess that's not being present because I'm reminiscing. But I was actually thinking about some experiences that I went through and how if I just remained present, it really would have helped me. So when I was growing up, I was pretty shy in school. And I remember when I reached about 17, 18, and I first started going to some bars, the idea of approaching a girl was terrifying. And I remember when I started going out, I did get some, some attention, some eye contact from girls. And, I think it was pretty obvious that I probably could have approached those girls. But in that moment of that deciding whether to or not, I would relay these different things in my head. So for example, I'd be thinking about the past. I'd be thinking about experiences that didn't go well when I approached a girl, or things that girls had said to me in the past which maybe lowered my self-esteem. Or I'd be thinking about future scenarios. So in these, all at the same time, I'd be thinking, well, what if she has a boyfriend? Or what if I misread the signal? What if she doesn't want me to approach? What if she finds me creepy? What if she's with her friends and then everyone laughs at me? Now, ultimately, these scenarios are ridiculous because at the end of the day, the worst thing that could happen was maybe someone laughs at me, or she says no, or ignores me. I mean, really, that's nothing in comparison to what my emotions were. My emotions were stopping me, and who knows, like, that could have been a future girlfriend that I just didn't act on, because these stories that I was telling myself, I wasn't being present. I was focusing on the past and the future simultaneously, and they were preventing me from taking action. And so I think that often in life, we often don't take the present moment and accept it is what it is. If I just walked up to her and started speaking to her, it could have been a whole different story. And have you ever wondered why so many people seem to sabotage themselves? Because none of us want to be unhappy, yet so many people are. Well, Eckhart Tolle basically discusses that this is the human ego, and that it is constantly striving to be the dominant force. And since the ego is somewhat on a subconscious level, it's kind of hard to understand just how much of an extent it has over our mindset. And one example that Eckhart Tolle gives us in the book is, say for example, you're having an argument with a loved one or a friend, and you say some pretty strong stuff that afterwards, when you think back, you think, why did I say that, or why did I overreact that way? And basically Eckhart Tolle says that this is the human ego at play. So the ego actually leads you into conflicts with others and makes you unhappy with the current situation, so ultimately it can take more control over your mindset and thinking. So that part of the book I did find really interesting, because I do feel like the ego does play such a large role in our life that maybe we aren't aware about. Using the example of going out for a meal with friends, let's say you did something silly, like maybe you said something that was a bit inappropriate, or maybe you spilt your drink and like ruined your outfit or whatever, and you kind of embarrassed yourself and your friends kind of took the piss a little bit. Often it's very understandable for people to get embarrassed and either overreact, or if they don't overreact, maybe later on and they have a bit of social anxiety to repeat what happened over and over again and almost punish themselves for saying something stupid when in the moment they just said it. And I think this is our ego, like, again, constantly trying to rely on us to relive these past things that we cannot change. Like, that's happened now, and most of our friends or whoever we were with probably wouldn't even remember what happened. But for us, we kind of continually play these messages over and over in our head in the hopes that we might learn for the future, when ultimately we won't. And I think as well, more than ever, ego is playing such a large role, and especially if you take 2020, for example, with our politics, we seem to be more divided than ever these days, and it's almost got to a point now where we can't even agree to disagree, and we can't be proven to be wrong. Everything you have to say is 100% fact and proven, and we have no error for error anymore. We can't admit we were wrong, otherwise we don't seem legitimate, which again I think is such a large part of our ego speaking. So I think we do have to be careful just how much we let our ego into our lives, because ultimately if we leave it untracked, it really could hinder just how much happiness we can actually get from life. And one of my mentors once told me something really interesting that I never really forgot. And she had said that when you're going through life, you have to imagine that you're a bus driver. You're driving those big yellow American school buses. And she said that you just have to imagine yourself that you're the driver, and in the back seat is all the voices and all the childhood issues and all the embarrassments that you had that are constantly telling you these messages, or that you're not worthy, or you're ugly, or you're overweight, or you're unhappy, or all these voices that are constantly throwing at you. But you have to remember that you are the driver, and these voices may never go away, and you have to accept them for what they are, but you just have to understand that you are the driver, and you can't let them derail you from where you want to go. So if you have a purpose in life and something that you want to achieve, you can't let these voices dictate where you go. So for example, if you want to start a YouTube channel, or if you want to start learning Spanish, or you want to join a football team, or anything you want to do, you shouldn't let these voices hinder, and you should remember that you are the driver, you're in the driving seat. Okay, so let's say we've taken this message and we've remained present in our lives. We're not worrying about the past, we're not worrying about the future scenarios that may or may not happen. We're just in this current moment and we're living life. What happens then? Well, unfortunately in life, as we all know, there are going to be some unavoidable pain in life and some traumas that we are going to go through, which naturally everyone will go through. And things like a death of a loved one, death of a family member. Unfortunately, we are all human, and our mortality is part of us, so unfortunately that will happen. However, Eckhart Tolle does go on to explain that just because we are present does not mean that we should obviously ignore these feelings. Now, a lot of people may not like this next message, but they might find it a bit hard to get on board with, but Eckhart Tolle basically explains that unfortunately when things like this happen in life, you just have to accept the mentality of what is meant to be is meant to be. Now, I think a lot of people that like to remain in control and a bit of control freaks, I think this is a really scary notion, because essentially you're surrendering to life. But unfortunately, as we all know, I think that is the only real true way to live, because we cannot control what we cannot control. And he explains that you should not ever feel embarrassed or ashamed of these emotions. You should fully accept them and give yourself the time. But the idea of being present is essentially that you shouldn't endlessly suffer with these emotions. So for example, you shouldn't keep relaying the same information or the same memories over and over again, and this endless cycle of tragedy. Or let's say you didn't get to say goodbye, or maybe the last thing you said wasn't right, or even the other spectrum, if you're worrying about the future, if something's coming and you don't really know how to handle it, that you shouldn't keep worrying about what the future might bring, because you don't actually know what's going to happen. So the idea of being present is you accept these feelings. You should never feel embarrassed of this hurt. Accept them and then try and move on as best you can, because the only way is through. And by being present, you will avoid most of the pain in your life, but not all of it. And furthermore, living in the present does not mean suppressing your pain or ignoring it. Instead, it kind of gives you that inner strength to accept what has happened and accept the painful facts of life. And after reading the book, one thing I did notice was that when explaining this idea to some people, there was this notion of, well, does that mean you just accept everything for what it is and then that's it? And whilst I think that's a reasonable question, ultimately I don't think it is. I don't think it's just, if life's shit, you just take it as shit, or if you're in a dead-end job or you're unhappy, then it just is what it is and you'll be happier. I think the idea is that it gives you that inner strength to actually make the change, think, okay, well, this is my present moment, what am I going to do? I think often in life, when we think of these huge tasks or these huge momentous things, we do inaction because it seems too hard or it's too scary, and we treat it like Everest. So say, for example, like filming a video, like for YouTube, the whole idea is, I've got to make a video, so I've got to film it, I've got to edit it, I've got to write a script, or I've got to upload it. Like, it's just a huge mammoth task. Whereas if you just remain present and just think, okay, well, what do I need to do? Okay, well, I'll set up my tripod, set up my camera, lighting, microphone. Okay, now I'm actually ready to shoot. And again, it's this notion of just being active, and just being active in the current moment, not sitting on the sofa or lying in bed worrying. It's actually, okay, I'm live right now, right this second. What do I want to do? And when you think about some of the happiest moments in your life, you do think about the times that you're just ultimately in your element and not worrying or focusing about anything else. Have you ever had those times that with your friends and you're just laughing so much that your belly hurts, or you can't breathe because you're just laughing so much? Or you're on holiday, or you're at a festival with friends and you're drinking and you're just like, this is the perfect moment, and you're not worrying about what other people think about you or how you're going to get home or anything like that. You're just having the best moment. And I think that is truly being present. That is really accepting what is happening right there and then. And finally, I actually wanted to speak about another book, and this book's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. And in the book, he has a final chapter all about death. And in this chapter, he goes on to explain about how human beings are such unique animals, in the sense that we are aware of our own demise, and that we'll actually spend all of our mortal lives seeking immortality, things that will create our legacy and leave our mark on the world. And it's this desire that causes people to chase fame or religion or politics. And also on an individual level, this is not good for our health or happiness, because of the amount of stress and anxiety caused to make sure that we leave that mark before we leave this earth. And so his suggestion is to not give a fuck. Essentially, don't worry about the fame or the power, and just worry about the here and now and live your life. So ultimately, I do really love this message of being present, and I think this is why I wanted to make this video. I know spirituality is not necessarily for everyone, and I can understand why. Sometimes it's when you're going through a really shit time, to think that you may be creating that self-inner pain can seem a bit insulting, so I understand that. But I think the idea of being present is ultimately a really healthy one. I think we're all guilty of overthinking things and making it way worse than it actually was, and when it actually happens, or let's say you're a nervous flyer and you're worrying about all these scenarios, and then you take the flight and it was perfect, and you're like, oh my god, I spent all those hours worrying about something that never happened. And the same with the past. I think if we keep relaying these messages and telling ourselves these messages, they become more serious. And I think the idea of being present and not worrying about any of that, and just accepting what is happening right this second is the only thing we can change, is ultimately a really healthy one. And I think that's a message that we should all spread. So if you take anything from this video, I just want you to remember that no amount of regret is going to change the past, and no amount of anxiety is going to change the future. You have to accept that what is meant to be, and control the now. Hope this helped, guys. Cheers.